the moment Eudora Callahan walked into that livestock auction in Abilene, Kansas, on a blazing Tuesday afternoon in the summer of 1878. Every man in the yard turned to look at her, and not a single one of them believed she was there to buy a horse. She was 24 years old, with copper-red hair pinned beneath a battered brown hat, green eyes that caught the sunlight like creek water over smooth stone, and calloused hands that told a story no man in that yard had the patience to read. She wore a plain cotton blouse tucked into dusty riding trousers, boots worn thin at the heel, and she carried herself with the straight-backed posture of a woman who had spent years convincing rooms full of doubters that she belonged exactly where she stood. The horse in question was a blue roan stallion named Devil's Ink. He was 16 hands of pure fury, a magnificent creature that had thrown 4 professional wranglers in the past 3 weeks and bitten clean through a lead rope just that morning. The auctioneer, a sunburned man named Hector Price, had been trying to sell the animal for 2 weeks and was beginning to think he'd have to put the stallion down just to stop paying for his feed. Eudora stood at the fence rail watching Devil's Ink pace his paddock, the stallion's hooves churning the dry earth, nostrils flared wide, eyes rolling with a kind of intelligent, furious energy. She studied him the way a reader studies a difficult page, not with frustration, but with concentration, parsing each movement for what it meant underneath. There were 11 ranchers gathered at that auction. She knew several of them by name, men from the surrounding counties who ran cattle spreads and grain operations across the Kansas plains. She had grown up among men like these, had worked alongside them on her father's modest homestead outside of Ellsworth, had driven cattle with them when she was old enough to sit a horse properly, and had spent the better part of 6 years watching them dismiss her opinions with the polite indifference men reserve for children and women in equal measure. She pushed away from the fence and approached Hector Price directly. "I want to try breaking that roan," she said. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 full seconds before the laughter began. It started with the man nearest to her, a heavy rancher named Comstock who ran a cattle operation north of the Smoky Hill River. His laugh was the kind that started low in the belly and rolled outward, generous and cruel in equal measure. It spread to the men beside him, rippling down the line of ranchers like a stone dropped into still water. Some of them tried to muffle it, producing strangled snorts through their noses. Others let it out fully, slapping their thighs or shaking their heads with the comfortable condescension of men who have never questioned their own judgment. Only one man did not laugh. He stood at the far end of the fence line, slightly apart from the others, as if he had arrived late or simply preferred the distance. He was lean, perhaps 30 or 31, with dark hair curling slightly at the collar of a worn canvas work shirt, a jaw shadowed with several days of beard, and brown eyes that were fixed not on Eudora but on Devil's Ink, watching the stallion with the same patient, analytical attention she had been giving it a moment before. When the laughter rolled down toward him, he did not join it. He did not even shift his gaze from the horse. He simply stood there, still and quiet as a fence post, as if he had not heard the joke or perhaps simply did not find it funny. Eudora noticed him because of that stillness. She noticed him the way you notice the one candle still burning when all the others have gone out. She filed the observation away and turned back to Hector Price, who was now composing his expression into something more professionally neutral, though amusement still twitched at the corners of his mouth. "Miss Callahan," he said, "that animal has put 4 of the best wranglers in this county on their backs. I appreciate the offer, but I cannot in good conscience—" "I am not asking for your conscience," she said evenly. "I am asking for your permission to enter that paddock. I will not hold you responsible if it goes wrong, and if it goes right, I want first consideration on the purchase price." Hector looked at the gathered ranchers. Comstock was still shaking his head, though the laughing had died down. 2 other men were exchanging glances that communicated, without words, a shared expectation of good entertainment. "All right," Hector said finally, "because what else do you say to a woman who looks at you like that? All right, Miss Callahan, but I am noting for the record that you entered of your own free will." "Noted," she said, and climbed the fence rail. The man at the far end of the fence watched her then, not with the anticipatory smirk of the others, not with the slight forward lean of men expecting a spectacle. He watched her the way you watch something you're genuinely trying to understand. His arms were crossed over the top rail, chin resting on his forearms, and he watched Eudora Callahan drop into that paddock with the calm attention of a man who has already decided the outcome might surprise him. What happened over the next 40 minutes was something that the men in that auction yard would talk about for a long time after, though they would not always tell the story the way it actually happened. Eudora did not rush the horse. She stood near the center of the paddock and let Devil's Ink come to her terms. When the stallion charged, she stepped aside rather than back. When he circled, she moved with him, keeping her body at an angle, never square on, never threatening. She spoke to the horse in a low, continuous voice that the watching men could not quite hear, the words themselves probably not mattering as much as the tone, steady and rhythmic as rainfall. It took nearly 20 minutes before the stallion stopped circling and stood still, sides heaving, watching her from across the paddock. It took another 15 before she touched him. And it took the full 40 before she had her hand along his neck, her forehead briefly against his, the stallion standing without restraint and not moving away. She did not mount him that day. That was not what she had promised. She had promised to begin the breaking, and she had done exactly that, establishing the first and most essential thing, which was trust. When she climbed back over the fence, the ranchers were quiet. Some of that quiet was respect. Some of it was the peculiar discomfort of men who have laughed at something, and then been made to feel small by their own laughter. The man at the end of the fence straightened up and looked at her as she landed on the far side of the rail, dusting her palms on her trousers. "That was the right approach," he said. It was a plain statement, no embellishment, no affected wonder, just a direct assessment offered as one horseperson to another. Eudora looked at him. Up close he was more weathered than she'd first thought, lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting into too much sun, a small scar along the left jaw. His hands, resting now on the fence rail, were as calloused as her own. "You know horses," she said. "I run a horse ranch," he said, "over near Sumner County. My name is Seth Langston. Eudora Callahan." "I know," he said. "Your father was Thomas Callahan. He ran a good spread outside of Ellsworth." "He died 2 winters ago," she said. Something moved in Seth Langston's expression, a small, genuine acknowledgement of loss rather than the clumsy condolence people usually offered. "I'm sorry," he said, and he said it as if he meant the 2 words precisely and did not need to add anything more to them. She turned back toward the paddock where Devil's Ink was still watching her from across the enclosure, and she felt, quite suddenly and without entirely welcoming it, that she had not been looked at as plainly as this man was looking at her in a very long time. Not looked at the way men sometimes looked at her, assessing her as a woman, measuring her against some private standard, but looked at the way a person looks at another person they find interesting and do not yet fully understand. "You're here for the auction?" she asked. "I was," he said. "I may be reconsidering some of my plans." She glanced at him sideways. "Meaning what?" "Meaning I came to look at a quarter horse they have in the South Pen," he said. "But now I'm wondering if you'd be willing to tell me how you learned that particular ground technique, because I've been trying to work a similar problem with a young mare, and I haven't been getting far." It was such a genuinely practical question, so entirely stripped of any of the performance or awkwardness she usually encountered from men trying to begin a conversation with her, that she almost smiled. "Buy me a coffee after the auction," she said, "and I'll tell you." "Deal," said Seth Langston simply, and turned back to watching the horse. The coffee happened at a small establishment on the main street of Abilene that sold coffee and pie and kept a table by the window where the afternoon light came in warm and yellow through dusty glass. Eudora ordered black coffee. Seth ordered the same. They sat across from each other, and talked about horses for 2 hours without either of them noticing the time pass. She told him about her father, who had been one of the few men of his generation in that part of Kansas, who believed that a horse broken through patience rather than force was worth twice the trouble. She told him how she had learned to read a horse's posture before its action, how a flick of the ear or a particular tension in the shoulder could tell you more than the most obvious signals. She told him about her method of introducing herself to a horse before attempting any kind of contact, almost as if you were being formally presented. Seth listened the way good listeners do, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually receiving what she said, asking questions that showed he had been paying attention. He told her about his own ranch, the Langston Spread, which ran about 300 acres of shortgrass prairie south of the Arkansas River, primarily quarter horses and some cattle, though it was the horses that interested him most. He had bought the place 4 years ago with money inherited from an uncle and had been building it up slowly, carefully, more interested in the quality of his stock than the quantity. He was 30 years old, she learned, and had grown up in Missouri before coming west. He had spent 2 years working on a cattle drive before he had enough saved to begin his own operation. He had no brothers or sisters living. His mother had passed when he was 12, and his father had remarried and drifted further west into New Mexico territory. He was alone in the way that people who have made themselves so become, not out of bitterness, but out of a kind of self-sufficiency that had its own loneliness built in at the foundation. She recognized it because she had the same quality herself. When the light through the window turned from yellow to amber and the cafe owner began meaningfully wiping down tables in their vicinity, they realized they had been sitting for considerably longer than intended. "I should get back," she said, gathering herself. "I have a boarding house room and a horse to tend." "Will you come back to the auction tomorrow?" he asked. "Hector Price is going to offer you a price on that roan if you've any interest. I know Hector. He's more impressed than he let on." "I intend to," she said. He stood when she stood, which she noted not many men remembered to do. He settled his hat on his head and held the door for her, and they walked out together into the evening street, where Abilene in the summer of 1878 was alive with the clatter and movement of a cattle town in full operation, drovers moving along the main thoroughfare, horses tied to rails outside the saloons, the smell of dust and horse and cook fires drifting on the warm air. "Miss Callahan," he said, when they reached the point where the street split and their respective boarding houses lay in different directions. "Mr. Langston," she replied. "I think you're the best horseperson I've ever watched work," he said, direct and quiet, the way he said everything. "And I've watched some very good ones." She looked at him steadily for a moment. The evening light was doing something kind to the planes of his face, softening the weathered lines, bringing out the dark warmth of his eyes. She felt something shift in her chest, small and careful, like a door easing open an inch in a quiet room. "Good night, Mr. Langston," she said. "Good night, Miss Callahan." She walked back to her boarding house and lay awake for a good portion of the night thinking about horses and not admitting to herself what she was actually thinking about. She did go back to the auction the next morning. So did Seth Langston. Hector Price did make her an offer on Devil's Ink, a price that was still steep but had come down considerably from the number he had opened with the previous day. She negotiated him down further, not aggressively but steadily, the way she did most things, and they settled on a figure that left her with enough from the sale of her father's last few head of cattle to buy the stallion and have a small amount remaining. The problem was that she had nowhere immediate to take him. Her father's homestead had been sold after his death to cover debts. She had been living for the past 18 months in a borrowed situation on a neighbor's property outside of Ellsworth, tending horses in exchange for room and board. But the neighbor had recently announced his intention to sell the property and move to Colorado territory, which left Eudora in a position she had been quietly dreading. She had the horse. She did not quite have the place to bring him. Seth Langston, who had been standing near enough to hear the end of her conversation with Hector Price, appeared at her elbow as she was signing the purchase papers. "I don't mean to presume," he said carefully, "but I overheard more than I should have. If you're looking for temporary pasture for that stallion while you sort your situation, I have room on my property. The paddocks are sound and I've got the hands to keep an eye on him." She looked at him squarely. In her experience, offers from men came with expectations attached, even when the men did not say so directly. She was good at reading that particular kind of subtext. She did not read it in Seth Langston. What she read was a practical man making a practical offer because he could see a practical problem and had the means to help with it. The offer was clean. "I would pay you for the board," she said. "That would be fine," he said, "and I would come out to work the horse. Regularly, he'll need consistent handling. The ranch is 3 hours south by road," he said. "You're welcome to stay in the bunkhouse. There's a separate small room at the end that's been empty since my last hand left for Texas." She considered this. It was 1878 and the considerations were real ones. A woman staying on a man's property, even in perfectly respectable circumstances, was the kind of thing that generated talk in a town as busy with its own opinions as Abilene or any of the surrounding communities. "I am not particularly concerned with what people say," she said finally, "provided the arrangement is exactly what you've described." "It is," he said, and she believed him. "Then I accept," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Langston." "Seth," he said, "if we're going to be sharing fence lines for a while, Mr. Langston feels like too much work." "Eudora," she said. He almost smiled. It was the closest she had seen him come to a full smile, and it changed his face considerably, warmed it from its usual thoughtful steadiness into something that made her chest do that quiet shifting thing again. They left Abilene the following morning with devil's ink on a lead rope behind Eudora's own horse, a dependable gray gelding named Copper, despite his color being nothing like copper, which had always struck her as funny in a small, private way. Seth rode ahead on a steady buckskin that matched its rider in temperament, and the 3-hour journey south became 4 because they took it slowly on account of the roan needing to settle. The road south ran through open grassland, the tall grass prairie of central Kansas in the full flush of late July, the grass gold-green and moving in long waves under a sky so blue it seemed painted. Red-tailed hawks circled over the fields, and prairie dogs stood upright at the edges of their towns to observe the passing riders. They talked during the ride, not constantly, not the way people talk when they are nervous and filling silence, but in the comfortable, intermittent way of people who are at ease enough to be quiet together and feel no need to apologize for it. She asked him about his horses, the breeding program he had been developing, the bloodlines he was working with. He asked her about her father, about the techniques she had learned from him and the ones she had developed herself. At one point, passing a long stretch of fence line that marked the edge of someone else's property, he told her that 6 months ago he had been approached by a land company from back east attempting to buy him out, one of several in his area targeted by the company's expansion westward. He had refused. "A lot of men didn't refuse," she observed. "A lot of men had less reason to stay," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, looking out over his own land as it came into view at the top of the next rise, that told her exactly what kind of man Seth Langston was. The Langston Ranch came into view at mid-afternoon, a clean, well-maintained spread with a solid timber house, 3 large paddocks, a proper barn with a hayloft, and 2 smaller outbuildings. A creek ran along the eastern edge of the property, its banks lined with cottonwoods that made long afternoon shadows across the grass. It was modest in scale, but everything was in good order, the fences straight, the buildings tight, the yard neat without being precious about it. A young man named Caleb, 17 and Seth's only current hand, came out of the barn to greet them. He was wide-eyed at the sight of devil's ink and wisely kept his distance as instructed. Eudora walked the roan to his new paddock herself, spending half an hour letting the horse explore the space, familiarize himself with the smells and sounds of his new surroundings before she left him to settle. Seth watched from outside the fence, that same attentive, non-intrusive observation he had offered at the auction. The small room at the end of the bunkhouse was exactly what he had described, spare and clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, a single window looking east toward the creek, and a hook on the door. It was as unpretentious as everything else about the place, and she liked it immediately. The days that followed established themselves into a rhythm that Eudora found unexpectedly sustaining. She was up before dawn most mornings, out to Devil's Inc.'s paddock while the light was still gray and the air still cool, working the horse through the slow, patient progression of trust building that this particular animal required. He was not a mean horse, she had decided. He was an intelligent one, which was more demanding. An intelligent horse needed to understand the reason for things. A mean horse you could sometimes overpower. An intelligent one you had to convince. Seth worked his own horses in the adjacent paddock in the mornings, and she found herself watching him as much as he watched her, noticing the quality of his attention, the steadiness of his hands, the unhurried rhythm of his work. He was good with horses. Not as good as her father had been, not yet as good as she was with certain types of difficult animals, but genuinely skilled, careful, and most importantly, willing to learn. One morning in the second week, he asked if he could watch her session with Devil's Inc. up close, from inside the paddock at the periphery. She agreed. He sat on the top rail of the fence on the inside and watched without making any sound or movement for the entire 45 minutes she worked, and afterward he said, "You use your breathing deliberately. I didn't notice that at the auction." "Yes," she said. "Horses feel anxiety before they see it. If you breathe steadily, you communicate a kind of steadiness that no movement or expression can produce on its own." "Show me," he said. So she did. She spent an hour teaching him the particular breathing technique, which was something she had never taught anyone before, not because she was secretive about it, but because no one had ever specifically asked to learn it. The experience of teaching something she had only ever done intuitively was interesting, requiring her to find words for things she had previously only known in her body. That afternoon, she helped him with the young mare he had mentioned at the auction, the one he had been struggling to bring along. The problem turned out to be simpler than he had thought, a question of approach angle, and once she showed him the adjustment, the mare responded within 20 minutes. Seth looked at the mare moving freely in the paddock, and then looked at Eudora with an expression that was part gratitude and part something more complicated. "I've been working that problem for 6 weeks, he said. "Sometimes you need a second pair of eyes," she said. "Sometimes," he agreed, "you need someone who sees things differently." She felt the statement land slightly outside its literal meaning and chose not to acknowledge that directly, turning her attention back to the mare. That evening, Caleb cooked a simple supper of salt pork and cornbread and beans, which he did competently if not elegantly, and the three of them ate together at the table in the main room of Seth's house, which was warm from the day's heat and smelled of wood and leather and coffee. Caleb was a cheerful, talkative young man who had a gift for filling silences with pleasant, inconsequential observations, and his presence at those evening meals gave the whole arrangement a comfortable, domestic ease that Eudora had not expected to find this far from anything she had previously called home. After Caleb went to the bunkhouse for the night, Seth and Eudora sometimes remained at the table over second cups of coffee, or sat on the porch in the cooler evening air, and talked. They talked about many things, about cattle prices and weather patterns, about the state of the ranges and the changes coming to the Kansas plains as the railroads extended, and the cattle drives began their slow shift northward. They talked about books, finding to mutual surprise that they had read some of the same ones, both having access at various points in their lives to the kind of small, circulating personal libraries that made their way through frontier communities in saddlebags and trunk bottoms. They talked about the Cheyenne and the Arapaho and the continuing injustice of the displacement, the forced removal of people from land they had lived on for generations, carried out under policies that Seth spoke of with a plainness and a frustration that surprised her. Most men she knew in that part of Kansas either avoided the subject entirely or held opinions that did not bear examination. Seth had thought about it, had read about it, and was angry about it in a quiet, serious way that had nowhere useful to go, which she understood as its own kind of grief. "My father used to say that the land didn't belong to any of us," she said one evening. "That we were just the latest in a long line of people who thought it did." "He sounds like he was a man worth knowing," Seth said. "He was," she said, and felt the loss of him again, that particular ache that had never quite closed over. "He was the best man I knew." Seth looked at her steadily across the porch. The evening was very quiet, only the creek and the cicadas and the distant sound of one of the horses shifting in the paddock. "I think he raised someone worth knowing, too," he said, quietly and directly, without any of the performance that such a statement might have had from another man. She met his eyes and held them for a moment longer than she usually permitted herself to hold a man's gaze, and the evening felt suspended in itself, full of things neither of them had said yet. "Good night, Seth," she said, finally, rising. "Good night, Eudora," he said, and she heard something careful and warm in the way he used her name. The third week brought trouble in the form of a man named Jasper Wade. Wade ran a substantial cattle operation to the northwest, and had, over the past 2 years, been methodically acquiring or pressuring out the smaller operations in his path, adding acreage to his already considerable holdings. He was not a violent man in the directly physical sense, but he was a man who understood how power worked in a community, who owed money to who needed what, and he applied that understanding with the patience of a long-range hunter. He arrived at the Langston spread on a Wednesday morning with 2 of his men and a smile that did not involve his eyes. Eudora was in the paddock with devil's ink when Wade and his men rode in. Seth came out of the barn to meet them, and she watched the exchange from across the yard, reading the body language with the same attention she gave to horses. Wade wanted to buy the South 40 of Seth's land, the section that ran along the creek. He made an offer that was fair in number but loaded in implication, the implication being that if Seth chose not to sell, future relations between the Langston operation and Wade's considerably larger one might become difficult. Seth's answer was polite, firm, and entirely clear. He was not selling any portion of his land. Wade's smile did not falter. He simply nodded, glanced across the yard at Eudora in the paddock, then back at Seth, and said something low that she could not hear from the distance. Whatever it was, it changed the quality of Seth's stillness from neutral to something harder underneath. After Wade and his men had ridden out, Seth walked back across the yard to the fence where Eudora stood with the roan. "What did he say to you just then?" she asked. Seth's jaw tightened briefly. "He made a comment about the arrangement here, the nature of it." "The nature of it," she repeated evenly. "He implied it wasn't a professional arrangement," Seth said, looking at her directly, because he was a man who looked at things directly. She felt a familiar heat rise in her chest, the particular anger of a woman who has spent her life having her professional competence reframed as something else by men who find it easier to do that than to take her seriously. "I see," she said. "I told him," Seth said, "that Miss Callahan was a professional horsewoman whose expertise was helping me with a training problem, and that his implications were as ignorant as his business practices." Something about the way he said it, the complete absence of apology in it, the straightforward defense of her professional standing, without any of the embarrassed hedging she might have expected, settled something in her that had been braced for a different response. "Thank you," she said. "He'll make trouble," Seth said, practical again. "He's the type, but he can't force a sale and I'm not selling." "No," she said, "I didn't think you would be." 3 days after Wade's visit, one of Seth's fence lines on the south pasture was found cut. 3 sections of wire lying in the grass with clean cuts that spoke of wire cutters rather than rust. A small group of Seth's horses had gotten through the break in the night, found their way to the creek, and 2 of them had wandered further onto an adjacent property before Caleb discovered the break at first light and spent the morning recovering them. Seth looked at the cut wire with the same steady expression he gave most things, and then spent the afternoon riding his full fence line with Caleb, checking for further damage. Eudora rode the southern section with him, the 2 of them moving along the fence in the early afternoon heat, the grass yellow-gold and crackling, a hot wind off the prairie carrying the smell of dry earth. "You should document it," she said. "Report it to the county sheriff." "I will," Seth said, "though I don't expect much to come of it." "Probably not," she agreed, "but it puts it on record." He glanced at her. "You've dealt with this kind of thing before." "My father dealt with it," she said. "There was a man who wanted our pasture land when I was 16. He tried every variation of pressure and inconvenience before he eventually gave up and went after someone else." "Your father held him off." "My father and I held him off," she corrected, without emphasis, just setting the record right. "Together." Seth looked at her for a long moment. "I believe that entirely," he said. They filed the report with the county sheriff, a tired-looking man named Dill who clearly had more pressing concerns than fence-cutting disputes between ranchers, but who wrote everything down carefully and promised to have a word with Wade. Whether that word was ever had was unclear, but no further fence lines were cut that month. What happened instead was more subtle. Wade began buying up the notes of 2 of Seth's neighboring small ranchers, the Holden family and old man Pratt, who ran 30 head of cattle on 60 acres. With the notes in hand, Wade had leverage over the neighbors, which he could use to restrict Seth's access to the shared water rights on the eastern tributary of the creek, a complication that would become critical by the following summer if the drought conditions held. Seth explained all of this to Eudora on the porch one evening in early August, laying it out in his quiet, methodical way, the full picture of the problem. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "How much are the Holt notes worth?" he told her. She thought for a moment. "The Holdens," she said. "Do they have daughters?" 3, he said, looking slightly puzzled at the direction. "An old man Pratt. His nephew in Topeka is his only family." She was quiet for a while, thinking. "There's a woman named Margaret Hay in Abilene," she said finally. "She runs what looks like a dressmaking shop but is actually the most successful informal lending operation in the county. She's been providing credit to homesteaders for 12 years. If the Holdens and Pratt could get their notes bought out by someone who isn't Wade, the leverage disappears." Seth stared at her. "How do you know about Margaret Hay?" "Because my father borrowed from her twice," she said. "She charges fair interest, she does not make pressure visits, and she has absolutely no interest in acquiring land. She just wants her principal and her rate." "You think she'd take on 2 more notes?" "I think if you were to ride into Abilene and speak to her, and mention Thomas Callahan's name, she would at least hear the proposal." She paused. "I could write you a letter of introduction if that would help." Seth Langston looked at her across the porch table with an expression she had not seen on him before, something that was more than respect and had not quite shaped itself into words yet. It sat somewhere between wonder and a particular kind of gratitude that went deeper than thanks for a practical solution. "Eudora," he said. "It may not work," she said quickly, because the way he was looking at her was doing things to her composure that she had no interest in examining at present. "It might," he said. "It might very well." He rode to Abilene 4 days later. Margaret Hay, as it turned out, was indeed willing to entertain the proposal, provided the terms were reviewed to her satisfaction. And by the end of the following week, both the Holden and Pratt notes had changed hands at a price that left Wade without his leverage, and, it was reported by various reliable sources, in a mood of considerable irritation. He made no further moves against the Langston operation that summer. Whether this was because of the setback, or because he found easier targets elsewhere, was impossible to say, but the immediate pressure lifted. The day Seth came back from Abilene with the news that the notes had been transferred, he found Eudora in the barn working a new exercise with devil's ink in the attached covered schooling ring. The stallion was moving in a collected trot along the rail, his earlier wildness channeled into something powerful and controlled, the beauty of what he had always been finally visible now that the fear had been removed. Seth stood in the doorway watching for a full 5 minutes before she brought the horse to a halt and turned. "It worked," he said. "Good," she said, running her hand along the stallion's neck. He walked into the schooling ring and stopped a few feet from her. In the cool dimness of the barn, the air smelled of horse and hay and the particular dry wood smell of old timber. "I want to say something to you," he said. She waited, holding the roan's lead rope, looking at Seth Langston in the quiet of the barn. "When I came to that auction 3 weeks ago," he said, "I was a man with a reasonable operation and a reasonable life, and nothing particularly wrong with it, and nothing particularly remarkable about it either. And I watched a woman get laughed at by 11 men for saying she could do something, and she went and did the thing, and it was not just that she did it, it was how she did it, that was the part that got me. The patience of it. The respect of it, and I thought that I had not met someone like that before." He paused, and she did not speak. "I still think that," he said. "Every day that I've watched you work and every evening we've talked, I think it more clearly. And I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean, so I want to be clear that I'm saying this one because I mean it very plainly." "What exactly are you saying?" she asked, and her voice was steady though her heart was not. "That I would like to court you," he said. "Properly, if you're willing." The roan shifted beside her, stamping one foot against the packed earth floor, impatient with the stillness of humans in the middle of deep feeling. "I am in a temporary living arrangement on your property," she said carefully, "with no settled situation of my own and a horse that is not yet fully broken and no immediate plan for where either of us is going after the summer. That is the state of things." "I know the state of things," he said. "It might complicate Eudora." He said her name the way he always said it, straight and warm, without decoration. "I'm not asking you to resolve all of that tonight. I am asking if you are willing." She looked at him for a long moment, the horse beside her breathed steadily. The afternoon light came through the high barn window in a single column of gold dust. "I am willing," she said. The smile that came to Seth Langston's face, then, was the fullest she had ever seen from him. Warm and unhurried and genuinely happy, and it made her feel as though something she had been carrying at a careful distance had simply and naturally arrived. Courting in the practical circumstances of a working ranch in Kansas in 1878 looked somewhat different from the parlor-sitting and formal calling of the eastern states, but it had its own particular beauty. They rode together in the early mornings when the work permitted, following the creek south toward the cottonwood groves, the air still cool and the light still pale gold, talking without destination. Seth had a way of asking her questions that showed he had been thinking about her when she was not there, asking her to expand on things she had mentioned days ago, connecting threads of conversation across time. He brought her a book from Abilene on his next supply run, a collection of natural philosophy essays that she had mentioned once, in passing, having seen a reference to it in another book years ago. The fact that he had remembered, had found it, had bought it, went directly through all her careful, composed distance and settled somewhere central. She thanked him without making a large thing of it, because that was how they were with each other, and she saw that he appreciated that. One evening they rode out to the high flat of the south pasture to watch the sunset, which in that part of Kansas in the late summer was a grand, theatrical affair, the whole western sky going through orange to crimson to deep purple with the kind of unhurried magnificence that makes a person feel both very small and very present at once. They sat on their horses side by side and watched it without speaking for a long time. Then Seth said, "I've watched that sunset probably 200 times from this field, and it has never once been the same twice." "No," she agreed. "I think that's the thing about this country," he said. "People come out here thinking it's empty, but it's not empty." It's full of the same thing over and over in a different way every time. She turned to look at him in the last of the red light. His profile was carved and still against the darkening sky, the lines of his face exactly as they always were, and she thought that he was himself exactly like that, the same in his core but constantly arriving at things in a slightly new way. "Seth," she said. He turned to look at her. She leaned from her saddle and kissed him, there in the last of the Kansas sunset on horseback above his south pasture, and he held very still for one breath and then kissed her back, one hand lifting to touch her face with the same gentleness he brought to everything he cared about. When they drew back, the sky had deepened to violet and the first stars were appearing. "Well," he said quietly. "Well," she agreed. He was smiling again, that full warm smile that she was already greedy for, and she felt no need to be embarrassed about that. "I should tell you," he said, "that I have been thinking about asking you that question since approximately the second morning you were here." "What question?" she asked. "The question of whether you would consider making this arrangement permanent," he said. "Not the horse boarding arrangement, the other one." She looked at him steadily. "That is a significant question." "It is." "You should ask it properly," she said, "when the time is right." "When will the time be right?" he asked. She thought about it sincerely. "When Devil's ink is fully broken," she said. His smile came back slowly, knowing and warm. "Then I suppose I have good motivation to let you work at your own pace." She laughed, and it was a real laugh, surprised out of her, full and unguarded, and he watched her laugh with an expression of such unmasked happiness that it made her laugh more. They rode back to the ranch in the dark, the horses finding their own way home along the familiar path, and the evening settled around the ranch with a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature of the air. Devil's ink did not break easily. He was not meant to, and Eudora would not have wanted him to. What she was doing was not breaking in the brutal old sense of the word at all, but building, layer by layer, a partnership between a horse of exceptional intelligence and a woman who understood what that intelligence required. It took 6 weeks from the day she first entered his paddock in Abilene to the morning in late August when she put her foot in the stirrup for the first time and felt the stallion hold steady beneath her. She did not mount him fully that day. She just stood in the stirrup for a moment, her weight settled there, her other foot still on the ground, and waited for his response. He turned his head and looked at her. She spoke to him. He turned his head forward again and breathed. She came down and gave him a long, unhurried moment of recognition and moved away. That was enough for that day. Seth, who had not been watching because she had asked him not to, having found that observation on critical training days changed the energy of the work, was waiting on the porch when she came back through the yard. "How did it go?" he asked. "Another week," she said. "Maybe 10 days. Are you eating?" He said, which was his way of asking how she was managing overall. A small, domestic question that she had come to understand as one of the primary ways he expressed care. He watched to see that she ate enough, slept enough, did not push herself past usefulness on the difficult days. "I'm eating," she said, and sat down on the porch step. "Caleb made biscuits this morning that were better than anything I've had in 6 months. "Don't tell him that," Seth said, sitting down beside her. "He'll expect praise for every meal." "He deserves praise for every meal," she said. "He's 17 and cooking for 3 people on a working ranch. When I was 17, I was barely managing not to burn water. Were you?" "My father had a gift for cooking," she said. "I did not inherit it. He spent 2 years trying to teach me and eventually gave up gracefully and took over the kitchen again." Seth smiled. They were sitting close on the step, shoulders almost touching, and the morning smelled of hay and coffee and the dry, sweet smell of late summer grass. "Tell me more about him," Seth said. "Your father." She leaned her head back against the porch post and thought about Thomas Callahan, trying to find the right words for someone who had been so much of her world. "He was a quiet man," she said. "Not in the way of men who are quiet because they have nothing to say, but in the way of men who save their words for things worth saying. He believed that most problems had a reasonable solution if you were willing to think about them long enough. He thought that patience was not the same as passivity, and that a person could be both very still and very strong at once. She paused. He taught me to read before I was 5. He taught me to ride before I was 7. He taught me that a horse and a person were not so different, both needing to trust before they could be asked to give. She looked down at her hands, the calloused palms, the strong, capable fingers. He never once told me there was something I couldn't do because I was a woman. He just showed me how to do things. And when I encountered men who told me I couldn't, I could never quite take them seriously because they didn't sound like my father. Seth was quiet beside her for a moment. Then he put his hand over hers, very simply, palm down over her fingers, warm and steady. "He'd have liked you," she said, without planning to say it. "I hope so," Seth said. She turned her hand over under his, and they held on to each other in the morning quiet, not saying anything more, the touch itself carrying what neither of them reached for words to express. The full breaking of Devil's Ink came on a Tuesday morning in the first week of September, with the air turned slightly crisper and a pale, gold quality to the early light that said the summer was beginning to let go. Eudora had been working the stallion through his paces on foot for the better part of an hour, and then she simply put her foot in the stirrup, came up smoothly, and settled into the saddle. Devil's Ink stood absolutely still for 3 full seconds. Then he took one step forward, and another, and moved into a walk that was collected and powerful and willing, his energy no longer the wild, fearful thing it had been, but transformed into something purposeful and magnificent, channeled through trust rather than broken by force. She rode him in a slow circle around the paddock, feeling the power of the animal beneath her, the particular electricity of a horse of this quality under saddle for the first time, and her eyes stung with something she did not permit herself to call tears until she was back at the fence and sliding down, and had her face pressed briefly against the stallion's neck where no one could see it. Seth was standing at the fence when she turned around. He had come out quietly and stood watching from the rail, and his expression was one she would keep in her memory for the rest of her life, pride and love and wonder all together in the face of a man she had come to know as the strongest, steadiest person she had ever met, looking at her as if she were something extraordinary. She walked to the fence. He was looking at her with that full, clear expression. "You said when the horse was broken," he said. "I did," she said. "Then I am asking," he said, "properly as I said I would." He did not go down on one knee. That had never been quite their way. He stood at the fence rail with his hands wrapped around the wood, and he looked at her steadily across it, the September morning light on his face, the stallion breathing quietly behind her, and he said, "Eudora Callahan, I am asking you to marry me. To stay here if you want to stay, or to go somewhere else if there's somewhere else you want to be, and I'll follow you there. I am asking you to be my partner in this life, because I do not think anyone was ever as right for me as you are, and I am very sure I have never loved anyone the way I love you." The straightforwardness of it, the unadorned honesty, was exactly what she would have wanted and exactly what she should have known he would offer. "Yes," she said. "I'll marry you, Seth." She was smiling and he was smiling, and the horse behind her stamped once in the September morning, registering his opinion. They were married in October, 6 weeks later in the small Methodist church in the nearest town, Caldwell, which lay about 15 miles from the ranch. The ceremony was attended by a modest gathering that included Caleb, who wore his best shirt and looked profoundly moved by the occasion, a few neighboring ranchers who had become allies and friends over the season, and Margaret Hay from Abilene, who had come at Eudora's personal invitation and sat in the second pew with the kind of serene satisfaction of a woman who has backed the right operation. The Holden family came, all 5 of them, with their 3 daughters in their Sunday dresses, grateful for the role Seth and Eudora had played in clearing their note from Wade's ledger. Old Man Pratt came alone and sat in the back and fell asleep briefly during the reading and woke with a guilty start, and Eudora caught his eye and smiled at him, and he looked deeply relieved. Jasper Wade did not come, for obvious reasons. Eudora wore a dress that she and Margaret Hay had selected together in Abilene, a deep blue wool that was elegant without pretension, with a small spray of late-season wildflowers from the creek bank pinned at the collar. She did not carry a formal bouquet because she had never been a woman for formal bouquets, but she carried the feeling of the morning inside her like something lit and warm. Walking down the aisle toward Seth Langston, who stood at the front of that small church in his best clothes with an expression of such direct, undisguised love on his face that the woman sitting in the third pew, whom Eudora did not even know, dabbed her eyes quietly with a handkerchief. The vows they exchanged were the standard ones of the time, but they said them to each other with the full weight of two people who had thought carefully about what the words meant. When Seth said he would love and cherish her, it landed as something specific and earned, not a general promise but a particular one, made by this man in this way to this woman, and she heard it accordingly. They rode back to the ranch that afternoon, husband and wife, through the golden October plains, the sky high and pale and the cottonwoods along the creek turned to brilliant yellow. The world looked the same as it had the day before and was entirely different. That winter on the ranch was the kind of winter that settles into memory as a place you return to. The work of the operation continued through the cold months, horses to tend, fences to check, supplies to manage, the small and necessary labor of keeping a working ranch alive through a Kansas winter. But it was also the season of coming to know each other in the way that only shared domestic life produces, learning the small rhythms of another person, their habits in the morning, and in the evening, the way they moved through a room, the things they said when they were tired or thoughtful or happy. Seth was a man who made things with his hands when he was thinking, small repairs, adjustments, improvements, and she would sometimes find him on a winter afternoon working at the table with a piece of harness or a hinge, his hands busy and his eyes somewhere interior. She learned not to interrupt those stretches, not because he was inaccessible during them, but because they were productive and he would come back from them having worked something out. He learned that she needed an hour in the early morning that was simply hers, before the work of the day, a cup of coffee and the first light and the horses from the window. And he gave that hour to her without comment or intrusion, rising and going directly to the barn while she had her coffee and the quiet. They argued twice over the winter, both times about things that were genuinely arguable, questions of stock management and the direction of the breeding program, and both times the arguments were direct, specific, and resolved without residue. Neither of them was a person who carried grievance, and in this they were extremely well matched. Caleb, over the winter, revealed a talent for carpentry that surprised everyone, including himself, and began building an addition to the barn that would give them a proper covered training area, working on it in the afternoons when the main chores were done. By January the frame was up, which was remarkable for a 17-year-old with limited materials, and both Seth and Eudora told him so plainly. Caleb flushed with pleasure and went back to measuring boards. Winter also brought the news that Jasper Wade had overextended himself. The aggressive land acquisition he had been pursuing had been partly funded by loans from a bank in Wichita that was itself in trouble, and with the over-leveraged notes suddenly called in, Wade was forced to sell off 2 of his outer pastures at a loss and dismiss most of his hands. The pressure on the neighboring operations evaporated overnight, and the atmosphere along the local range improved considerably. Seth received this news with equanimity. He did not take particular satisfaction in another man's trouble, but he acknowledged, quietly, that the situation was probably just. Spring came early to that part of Kansas in 1879, the grass beginning to green in late February, and with the spring came the full flowering of what the Langston Ranch was becoming. Devil's Ink proved everything that Eudora had seen in him, a breeding stallion of exceptional quality, his offspring already drawing interest from ranchers across the region before the first foal was even on the ground. The reputation of the operation began to spread as that of a place that produced quality horses, handled with exceptional care. Eudora was at the center of that reputation, and she did not shy away from it. She began formally offering her services as a horse trainer to ranchers in the surrounding counties, going out several times a month to work with problem horses, and charging a fair rate for her time and expertise. The business grew steadily through the spring and summer. There were still men who received her with the particular condescension she had spent her life navigating, but there were increasingly more who had heard of her work and were willing to set aside their assumptions long enough to see the results. Seth was unfailingly matter-of-fact about her work, treating it as the serious professional enterprise it was, negotiating on her behalf when a client was slow to pay, making it entirely clear to anyone who might otherwise wonder that she ran her portion of the operation independently, and with his full and unqualified support. She did not need him to do those things, but she found that having a partner who did them willingly, and without being asked, made a difference she had not known to expect. By midsummer she knew she was expecting a child. She told Seth on a July evening after supper, simply and directly as she did things. He went very still for a moment in the way he went still when he was absorbing something significant. Then he stood up from the table, crossed to where she was sitting, crouched down to her level, and took both her hands in his, looking at her with an expression that was equal parts joy and the kind of serious attention you give the most important things. "Are you well?" he said, because that was the first thing he asked. "Very well," she said. He pressed his lips to her hands and stayed like that for a moment, and she felt the warmth of him and the certainty of him and thought that whatever the next year brought and whatever the years after that, she was very much where she was supposed to be. "I hope it's a boy," he said, sitting back down beside her, "though I know that's a useless thing to hope." "Why a boy?" she asked. "I had no brothers," he said. "I always wanted one. A son feels like the next thing to that. And if it's a girl—" "Then she'll be the finest horsewoman in Kansas," he said simply. "She'll have good teachers." Eudora smiled. "She certainly will." The pregnancy progressed well through the summer and into the fall, Eudora continuing to work throughout, adapting her methods as her body required, spending more time on foot than on horseback in the later months, but not stopping work entirely, because stopping entirely would have been contrary to her nature, and Seth knew better than to suggest it. Confining himself to ensuring she was not left alone on difficult days, and that there was always something warm and nourishing available when she came in from the paddock. Caleb, now 18 and possessed of the solemn gravity of a young man who is aware of the significance of events, was extremely careful around Eudora in the last weeks, opening doors and carrying things with such deliberate consideration that she eventually told him kindly to stop before she tripped over his helpfulness, and he laughed and relaxed and went back to being his normal, useful self. The child was born in the first week of March 1880, on a clear, cold morning when the light on the Kansas plain had that particular sharp, clean quality of late winter giving way to early spring. He was a boy, healthy and robust and furious at the world in the way of newborns, with Seth's dark hair and Eudora's green eyes and an expression of concentrated indignation that made both of his parents laugh at first sight. They named him Thomas Seth Langston, the Thomas for Eudora's father. Seth, when he held his son for the first time, said nothing at all for a long time, just stood at the window with the infant against his chest, looking out at the ranch he had built, and Eudora watched him from the bed and felt the shape of their life together settle into something that was complete without being finished, full without being full yet, still going and still good. The recovery from the birth went well, Eudora being constitutionally unsuited to prolonged convalescence and back on her feet with more speed than the midwife, a capable German woman named Mrs. Baumer, considered strictly appropriate. Seth and Caleb took over the majority of the paddock work for 6 weeks without complaint, Caleb developing in that period a genuine facility with the younger horses that surprised no one more than himself. By summer, Thomas was settled into the rhythms of ranch life in the basket that Caleb had built for him out of cedar wood, placed where Eudora could see him while she worked in the covered training ring. And Devil's Ink would occasionally drift toward the fence nearest the basket, and stand there with the focused attention of a horse who has decided he is responsible for something, which made Eudora simultaneously amused and quietly moved. The years moved forward the way good years do, each one adding to the one before it without erasing it. The Langston Ranch grew in reputation and in modest prosperity, building toward something sustainable and true. Seth expanded the paddocks and improved the water system with a more reliable trough arrangement connected to the creek. Eudora's training practice became recognized beyond the local counties, with clients coming from as far as Wichita and occasionally further. And she was written about once in a Wichita newspaper in an article about frontier horsemanship that described her techniques with admiring accuracy, and referred to her as a woman whose skill with difficult horses has no equal in the region. Seth cut the article out and put it in the desk drawer where he kept important documents. "You kept it," she said when she found it, several months later, looking for the deed to the south pasture. "Of course I kept it," he said, not looking up from the harness he was oiling. She looked at him. He was 33 years old now, and the years of outdoor work had carved his face further, deeper lines at the corners of his eyes, a permanent slight squint from the sun. But the quality that had made her notice him at a fence rail at an auction in Abilene was exactly the same, unchanged and essential, that stillness that was not absence but depth. "Seth," he looked up. "I want you to know," she said, "that this has been the best life I could have imagined." He set down the harness and came across the room to where she stood and put his arms around her, pulling her in with the ease of two people who have held each other so many times that the fit is known and natural. "We're not done yet," he said into her hair. "No," she agreed, pressing her face against his shoulder. "Not even close." Thomas was 2.5 when they discovered that Eudora was expecting again. This news received with the same serious joy as the first, though without the initial uncertainty. They were practiced parents now, or rather they were parents who had learned that parenting is not a thing you become practiced at, but a thing that continuously demands freshness. And they were the right kind of people for that ongoing requirement. The second child was a girl, born in the autumn of 1882 on a day that smelled of wood smoke and dry grass, and they named her Clara June Langston. The Clara for no one in particular, but simply because they both liked the sound of it, and the June because she had the sunny, open quality of a June morning from the first day, looking around at the world with wide, curious, undisturbed interest. Thomas, who was now a solid, serious toddler with Eudora's straight-backed posture and Seth's deliberate quality, regarded his new sister for a long moment when introduced, then patted her head with one hand the way he patted the noses of the young foals, careful and considering, and announced that she was small. "She'll get bigger," Seth told him. Thomas considered this and nodded, satisfied, as if settling a philosophical point. Caleb, now 20 years old and technically an employee of the ranch but practically a member of the family, had his own life beginning to take shape alongside the Langston story. He had been quietly courting the older Holden daughter, a practical, steady girl named Ruth who had her mother's good sense and her father's patience. And by the spring of 1883 he had asked her to marry him, reported this fact to Seth with a combination of pride and anxiety, and was told by both Seth and Eudora that it was the best news they had heard since Thomas started sleeping through the night. The Holden family, who had not forgotten the role Seth and Eudora had played in clearing their land note from Wade's ledger, welcomed the match with genuine warmth, and the wedding that fall was a lively, generous celebration that brought together most of the ranching community they had built relationships with over 5 years of steady, honest work. By this time Jasper Wade had entirely left the region, having sold his remaining holdings and moved, it was said, to California, where presumably he would find other people's fences to cut. The land he had held reverted through various sales to people who were more interested in working it than in using it as leverage, and the stretch of range along the Arkansas River south of the Langston property took on a different character, more settled, more mutual. The community that the Langstons inhabited had its difficulties and its griefs like all communities do. A drought in 1883 took two families off their land and left others struggling, and Seth and Eudora opened their hayfield, and their credit as far as they could extend it to the neighbors most severely affected. A prairie fire in the following summer ran west of them and missed their land by half a mile, close enough that Seth spent 3 days with his neighbors helping to rebuild fences and outbuildings, and Eudora ran the water wagons from the creek until her arms ached. These things were the texture of frontier life in that period, the constant negotiation with a landscape that was magnificent and indifferent in equal measure. And they moved through it the way they moved through everything together, with the practical love of two people who have decided that the person beside them is where they want to be when the hard things come. The autumn that Thomas turned 5, Seth began teaching him to sit a horse. It was, inevitably, a low-key, patient process. The boy placed on the gentlest of the ranch's older mares and walked in slow circles while his father held the lead rope, and his mother watched from the fence with an expression that she would not have described as worried, but which was, perhaps, very attentive. Thomas sat the horse with his mother's straight back and his father's stillness and showed no fear whatsoever, looking around at the familiar yard from this new height with interested satisfaction. "Good," Seth told him. "Keep your heels down." "His heels are perfectly down," Eudora said from the fence. "I was noting it for the record," Seth said. She gave him a look and he returned one, and between those looks passed the entire comfortable shorthand of 5 years of marriage, amusement and love, and the particular ease of two people who know each other very well. Clara, by 2, had already demonstrated that she was not going to be a child who watched things happen when she could instead attempt them herself. She had her mother's will and her father's steadiness, and a combination of both their obstinacies that would, Eudora predicted to Seth one evening, make their lives interesting for the next 20 years. "The Callahan stubbornness," Seth said, with complete affection. "The Langston stubbornness," she returned. "A formidable inheritance," he agreed. She was sitting in the chair by the fire, mending a tear in the knee of Thomas's trousers, and Seth came to sit on the arm of the chair the way he sometimes did, not quite formal enough to take his own chair but wanting to be near her, and she leaned her head briefly against his arm and felt the solid reality of him, the years of him, the life they had built day by ordinary day until it was something extraordinary. "Seth," she said, "do you remember the auction in Abilene?" He was quiet for a moment, and she felt the slight change in him that meant he was returning to something significant. "I do," he said. "Do you remember what I said to Hector Price? You said you could break the horse." "And 11 men laughed," she said. "10 of them laughed," he said with precision. She turned her head to look up at him. He was looking at the fire, the light of it warm on his face, his expression the steady, honest one she had learned to read as well as she read anything in this world. "Why didn't you laugh?" she asked. It was the question she had never directly asked, had wondered about and understood abstractly but had never put directly to him. He thought about it for a moment, the way he thought about things, genuinely and without performance. "Because you were watching the horse," he said. "Everyone else was watching you. You were watching the horse. And anybody who is watching the horse instead of the gallery when the gallery is watching them knows something real about what they're doing." He paused. It would have been stupid to laugh at that. She looked at him for a long, quiet moment, this man who had stood at the far end of a fence rail and refused to be laughed into laughing, who had asked her a practical question, and bought her a coffee, and offered her a room and a paddock and a year of patient, honest presence, until she had come to understand that what she was being offered was not just those things but a life. "I loved you from that moment," she said. "I didn't know it at the time. I thought I was just noticing a man who wasn't laughing, but that was when it started." He looked at her, and the firelight was doing something warm and gold on both of them, and his expression was that open, direct love that she had come to think of as the most beautiful thing she had ever been given. "I think I loved you from when I watched you with the horse," he said. "From the first 5 minutes. I thought, there is a person who knows something true about how to be in the world, and I would like to know more about her." She reached up and put her hand against his face, feeling the familiar texture of the jaw, the warmth of his skin, and he turned his head and pressed his lips to her palm, a small, domestic, deeply felt gesture. Thomas, from his pallet in the corner where he was supposed to be sleeping and was not, said, "Are you going to keep talking?" Both of his parents turned to look at him. He was lying on his side with his hands folded under his cheek, watching them with entirely alert 5-year-old eyes. "You're supposed to be asleep," his father said. "I know," Thomas said, with the tone of someone who has been told this before and finds it understandable but not immediately compelling. Eudora stood, setting aside the mending, and went to her son, smoothing the blanket over him and pressing her lips to his forehead. He smelled of soap and horses and the warm, specific smell of small, sleeping children. "Sleep," she told him. "All right," he said agreeably, and closed his eyes with the immediate compliance of a child who was already most of the way there. She stood for a moment looking at him, this solid, serious, beloved boy, and then at the cradle across the room where Clara was making the small, regular breathing sounds of deep infant sleep, and then at Seth, who had come to stand beside her. The ranch was quiet around them, the horses settled in the barn, the Kansas night enormous and starred beyond the windows. The fire had burned down to a warm orange glow. Everything that they had made was present in that room in that moment. The years of work and patience and love, the children and the horses and the partnership between two people who had found each other by the grace of an auction yard in Abilene and a fence rail, and the simple, essential fact that one man had not laughed when a woman said she could do something. Seth put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood in the warm room with their sleeping children, looking at everything they had built. And it was not perfect because nothing in this world is perfect, but it was true and it was real and it was theirs. And in this particular life on this particular Kansas plain in the particular honest years they had shared, it was everything. The spring that followed was one of the finest the region had seen in years, rain coming at the right intervals, the grass growing thick and green along the creek banks, the cottonwoods in full, early leaf by mid-April. Devil's Ink, 8 years old now and in the full magnificence of his mature years, paced his paddock in the mornings with a settled authority that was entirely different from the fearful energy that had sent 4 wranglers to the ground in Abilene. He was what he had always been capable of being, extraordinary and willing, because someone had had the patience and the knowledge to show him that the world was not something to be afraid of. Eudora watched him from the fence one April morning with her coffee, Thomas beside her on the rail, Clara on her hip, Seth coming across the yard from the barn with the unhurried walk of a man who has nowhere else he needs to be. "He's a good one," Thomas said, watching the roan with the knowledgeable assessment of a child who has grown up surrounded by horses and absorbed the vocabulary of their evaluation. "He's the best I've ever worked with," his mother told him. "Better than Copper." Copper was reliable, she said, with the fond precision of someone characterizing an old friend accurately. "Devil's Ink is remarkable. Those are different things." Thomas considered this with the gravity of a boy approaching 6, storing it away in whatever interior place he kept the things he was learning. Seth came to stand beside her, taking the coffee cup from her hand and drinking from it without asking, which was one of those small domestic intimacies that signal the deepest ease. "The Hennessy brothers are coming out Thursday," he said. "They want to see the spring foals." "Good," she said. "Show them the bay colt first. He's the one they'll want." "Agreed." They stood at the fence in the April morning, the family they had made, watching the horse that had brought them to each other, And the life they were living was the life they had built, and it was going to keep going, and it was good. There would be more seasons ahead of them, more droughts and more floods, more neighbors to help and more hard winters to get through, more foals born in the cold early mornings, and more long evenings on the porch watching the Kansas sky do its nightly magnificence. There would be more to teach Thomas and Clara, more ways to be shown what parenthood required. There would be arguments and reconciliations and ordinary Tuesdays and extraordinary ones. There would be the slow, accumulating treasure of years, spent in the presence of someone who knows you clearly and chooses you completely. Seth Langston had stood at the far end of a fence rail in Abilene in the summer of 1878 and not laughed, and everything had followed from that. Not because the not laughing was heroic, but because it was honest, because it was the small, true thing that revealed the larger true thing underneath it, that he was a man who saw what was actually there rather than what he expected to see. And Eudora Callahan had noticed that stillness, that single candle burning when the others went out, and had walked toward it, and found that it was not a single candle at all but something warm enough to build a life inside. The April morning held them in its light. The horse moved in the paddock. The children leaned on the fence. The Kansas plain spread out in every direction, enormous and alive, as it had always been and would continue to be, long after the specific individuals living their small, significant lives upon it had given way to other ones, other loves, other mornings exactly like this one, and entirely their own. Thomas asked if he could go in with the horse, and Eudora said, "Not yet," and promised, "Soon." And the boy accepted this with the same patience that had been modeled for him every day of his life by two people who understood that patience was not waiting but a kind of attention, a way of honoring the thing you were waiting for by giving it the time it needed to be ready. Soon, she had said. And she had always meant it, always delivered, and she would again.